In many ways, we are living in a golden age. We have now texts that were previously unavailable, and where they were available largely remained either untranslated or, at best, the translations were inadequate. I certainly think of certain translations of the Perem Khru, the Egyptian Book of Coming Forth by Day. You may know it as the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Whilst the most famous early translation by Wallace Budge was good for its day, it was already lacking somewhat. In many ways, his translation was as influenced by his theology. He believed that all spiritual practice was a long-running evolution from animism, shamanism, through polytheism, eventually to monotheism, and one does not need to guess where he thought that the end position of this would be. But for those not so sure, he saw Protestant Christianity, especially that of the late 19th, early 20th century, as being the pinnacle of spiritual development. This was, of course, founded in his culture, in his worldview, which was framed from being a member of the British elite with some familiarity with esoteric teachings, which were very popular at the time, but ultimately were bound to a particular worldview, both theologically and also politically, all coming together for him to see his position as being that which is the pinnacle of development. This is much akin to many who adhere to textual-based spiritual paths, where the text, usually one they're not that familiar with, and if they are, it's from a nuanced translation, and their communications or conversations with the divine, where the divine seems to confirm very much their own prejudices and predilections. Fortunately, as the worldview of Wallace Budge and others has faded largely into the molasses of history that we find ourselves in now. And in so doing, we have decoupled a lot of our research from using it to confirm the worldview of us, to being allowed to speak from the worldview that the text was written in. One of these texts that has developed a huge amount of interest are, of course, the Greek Magical Papyri. These are texts very much a product of the Alexandrian school. They are Greco-Egyptian. That is, they draw heavily from Greek and Egyptian with smatterings of Judaism and Chaldeic philosophy, all melded together into this blancmange, this holy papier-mâché of spirituality. And in many ways, it's this very syncretism which speaks loudest to us now. Alexandria was in its day the great meeting place. This is the 2nd century BCE to about the 3rd century CE. It was a meeting place of diverse views and opinions, of course, fostered by the existence of the great library of Alexandria and the culture that grew up around this. And as a result, it becomes one of the great beacons of our civilization till it was finally snuffed out in the fires and knives of intolerance. In the 18th and 19th century, copies of these texts started to become available, but they were largely ignored unless read in pieces by people with curious leanings into spiritual ephemera, people who collect little jewels, but in so doing you lose the full flavor of the text. And the text is very much clearly written as a working volume, the one that we have, and has been admirably translated by Hans-Dieter Betz. You can get hard copies of them. They're a little pricey, not much, but you can get PDFs if you search. And these texts are roughly organized, but the logic of the organization is difficult to discern, and that's because ultimately the logic of the organization was the person that used these wrote them down as they learned them and used them. There are no explanations made as to these texts, and many of the rituals will talk, for instance, about you observing fasts over a period of time, or doing a ritual over a period of time, getting up before dawn or going at night. Every now and again, of course, avoiding seafood is, especially fish, is recommended for many of these rituals. And for those so interested, this is actually the Egyptian elements of it. When you serve before the holy gods, one of the things that you traditionally did was to declare, I have not eaten fish. For even though you may offer fish to the divinities, they didn't like the smell of it in our bodies, and it seemingly provided a form of pollution to us for the working of spirituality. Of course, the other flip side of this is that abstaining from fish, which was a very common food in Egypt, the River Nile, as well as the sea off Alexandria and the Delta, by abstaining from this common food, you are separating yourself from regular life. And as such, you are entering into an otherworldly state, which allows you to remove yourself from the ordinary and to embrace the extraordinary, the supernatural, the esoteric. But in so doing, you are bringing holiness into the world as much as you are bringing yourself into a state of holiness. And of course, once you've finished, then you perform purification rites and make your final offerings, and then you eat fish and you enjoy it. I, for instance, when I do workings, especially if I'm doing workings in the Greek Magical Papyrus, I'll usually abstain from fish at least 24 hours, but usually 4 to 9 days. when we come to work with these documents, with these texts, with these rituals, and they are profoundly powerful, one of the problems is they have no context. They don't talk about the meanings of many things. There are long, confusing, at times, incantations, which we tend to see in some Gnostic texts, of course. And if you wanted a more modern manifestation of this, you certainly could go to Carl Gustav Jung's Septem Sermones ad Mortuum, the Seven Sermons of the Dead, where he recites this long, seemingly nonsense set of words. Fortunately, scholars who wish the text to speak for itself and not to speak for their own predilections have begun to look at many of these long incantations and have found, in fact, that rather than being gibberish, they are, in fact, sacred sentences. They are mantras. And when chanted, paying attention to long and short vowels, wink, wink, and spoken out loud, especially when done in a meditative state, they have a profound effect upon your psyche. And once you understand the meaning behind some of them, then their software becomes fully active. And these then become empowered spells. One of the problems with this collection of texts are that there's very little discussion about the context. There's very little discussion about the preparation, about the creating of the magical or spiritual environment, and the creating and the dissolution of the magical or spiritual environment. And it's just not discussed. And there are those who sit there and think that this is some key to something more similar to modern chaos magic. This could not be further from the truth. The reason these things are missing is because they were so obvious that no one needs to be told about this. Whether one is forming a magical circle, which is a more Chaldean style of magic, very popular in the Renaissance and the Middle Ages, then in theory you would know how to do this. Or if one is taking a more Egyptian approach, then your magical workings are done within your sacred space, your shrine room, and this becomes the defined space. And its power and its protection, as well as its bridge to the other world, is one that is formed from regular, note the word, regular spiritual practice. And in this, it very much ties in to what we know when we look at tantric practices from India, Tibet, Mongolia, and what used to be Central Asia, is that these things don't occur as standalone practices, but are part of the spiritual armory of the magician. And I use the magician in the context of the Magi, which is a philosopher, a spiritual sage, whether that's male or female. This is something, for instance, adequately explored under Magica Hiera, Sacred Magic, Ancient Greek Magic and Religion, which is edited by Christopher Faraone and Gobing, which includes essays by Strub, Versnell, Kantansky, Graf, Winkler, Betts, of course, and Phillips. And what they argue in this text is that what we call magic was not seen as a standalone in ancient Greek and, in fact, in ancient religion, full stop, but that was simply the sacred science. And in many ways, if one looks at modern remnant practices, such as prayers, novenas to saints, similar things to this, these are magic. We just choose not to call it magic because we go, no, that's praying for a result. That is performing sacred rituals condoned by the church. Well, when you live in a world where there is no church, but there is tradition, and there is an understood sense of holiness, then what's the difference, really? The main difference is you are free to explore and develop, and run the risks of walking down sometimes dark and unsought for paths, and in that you either find your calling or you then develop your skills in learning how to bring yourself back onto the path that you wish to walk on. Missing in what I've discussed, of course, is the work of Dr. Skinner. I am a big fan of Dr. Skinner. I accept that his translations are excellent. His works are unquestionable works of great scholarship, and scholarship based upon someone who actually does these things, uses these rituals. Where I do depart from him is his view that texts such as the Greek Magical Papyrus, much like the Goetia, is basically a Meccano set, and that if you follow the instructions you will get the result. And I don't deny that that is possible. But what he does deny is that these things are spiritual, that there is a spiritual dimension to this, and that our relationship with the powers that we are working with is one that is framed within a spiritual framework. He is rather of the command economy and immediate gratification if you follow the instructions strictly. And in many ways, I'm not denying that this is possible. But in my own personal practice, I would argue that the process is unfulfilling. When, for instance, one invokes certain deities, and then one, for instance, concludes, several of the rituals conclude with the statement, Serapis is the true Zeus. Saying this is one thing, but understanding who Serapis is and Zeus, and in fact understanding the framework within which the divine was understood in the ancient world, and it was not as basic and as primitive as certain groups like to say. Oh, they worshipped stone idols. The ancient peoples of the world saw these objects as holy, but they did not see them as the gods. The divine powers dwelt within them, and they shared in the divinity of the whole universe. But they of themselves were not the gods. And in fact, their understanding of the gods was much more in keeping with that as taught by Krishnamurti, who argued that there is only one divine, but that the divine manifests in ways that we find understandable. Does this mean that that is not real and you're not having a relationship with them? No, not at all. You have a profound relationship, and that is framed within the divinities you work with and have a relationship with. But that ultimately, the energy that we draw from is one profound, powerful substratum of being, the atom, Sechem, Brahma. All cultures have this word, and within the highest echelons of those who understood and were taught the mysteries and were, for want of a better word, educated in the sacred science, they understood this. Did this mean that one did not have a relationship with particular deities where there was an emotional bonding? No. But that does not remove the philosophical depth behind this. And in this, they are very much closer to the teachings of the Upanishads and of Tantra, wherein we are emanations of the base field of existence, and we don't question our own identity, though that identity transforms and changes over time. Am I the me that was me when I was 7? Was as much a philosophical question in the Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom as it is now. Am I that same person? Does the karma generated by me when I was ignorant and chaotic the same as the karma that I generate now? And am I burdened by that? Well, yes, I am burdened by it, but am I that same person? No, I am not. And within ancient philosophies, this was understood too. So that when we approach texts like the Greek Magical Papyrus, we can approach them from what they are on their face, which is a collection of texts lacking in background depth and philosophy. But what we are doing is making a judgment upon a person's notebook. And we're doing that without understanding the library that they have access to, because all we have is the notebook. So that when we approach working with the Greek Magical Papyrus, it is important for us to understand the philosophy, the context of the world it was written in, but then to understand that we are using it in our own time. And strangely enough, with all respect to Dr. Wallace Budge, once we do this, we actually find that the ideas behind this are, rather than being some primitive stage of spirituality, are expressions of yearning, expressions of understanding that if I am to live a life sacred, I can't. Not everyone is able to live in a barrel or to wander around in ragged robes begging, but that sometimes we live in cities, we live in communities, we have lives, but that does not mean that those lives are bereft of meaning and depth, nor of the practice of mysteries. I heartily recommend the Greek Magical Papyrus, but I do recommend backing up your approach to the Greek Magical Papyrus with texts such as Magica Hiera, Ancient Greek Magic and Religion. edited by Faraone, Faraone, and Obing, Obbink. It is possible to buy this text rather easily or to find PDFs of it if you are so inclined. I heartily wish your journey in exploring these opens doors to you that make you try and seek the meaning behind them, the philosophy behind them, the ideas behind them, but also to recognize that these texts are the expressions of yearnings for things that we all view as important in life. And sometimes that is wealth, sometimes that is money, sometimes that is love, and every now and again, the need to express our anger. Though that is a conversation for another time. And so the Greek Magical Papyrus, I pray you find a journey into it, and I hope that it gives you meaning and opens doors to you that maybe you hadn't thought of opening, and in so doing, the wisdom of Alexandria and the Greco-Egyptian tradition will live again, and in so doing, you will know, as they did, that the true Zeus is Serapis. Namaste.